Our team coverage now turns to Western Mass News reporter Tyler Beraldi after hearing from local officials about their reactions to that fiery meeting. Tyler?
Chris, I got the chance to speak to two congressmen in the immediate aftermath of this interaction between President Trump and Zelensky. And to say they're shocked would be a bit of an understatement.
I never thought that there would be a day when we would vote with Russia and North Korea at the United Nations against an ally.
Democratic Massachusetts Congressman Richard Neal reacting after witnessing Friday's contentious Oval Office meeting, cutting talks short between President Trump and Ukraine's President Zelensky.
I think we all should be stunned that an American president would be taking a pro-Russian side of the argument against an American ally and against NATO.
A sentiment reflected by fellow Democrat Jim McGovern, who claims that the actions of President Trump and Vice President Vance embarrassed the nation on a world stage.
It's a sad day that the United States appears to be on the side of Putin and not on the side of democracy.
McGovern maintaining that what he witnessed was not in line with his interpretation of American ideals.
And I've always believed that if the United States stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. And that means supporting countries who are trying to protect their democracy.
And Neal emphasizing that although the exact consequences of Friday's meeting remain to be seen, he believes that siding against NATO would be a major mistake, even though Ukraine is not currently a member of NATO.
We're not asking for the commitment of troops on the ground. We're simply asking for continued military assistance, which is supported by just about every NATO nation. And if there's been an enduring alliance that has worked, it has been NATO.
It's worth noting that we have reached out to Republican officials in our area and are waiting on responses at this time. For now, reporting in studio, Tyler Beraldi, Western Mass News.